I remember the exact moment the transport docked. It wasn't because of the sound, although the magnetic clamps hitting the station ring were loud enough to rattle the overhead conduit pipes and send a tremor through the walkway grating under my boots. It wasn't the light either, even though the arrival bay flooded orange when the docking seal pressurized and the status lamps shifted from amber to green all at once. It was the silence. The entire arrivals bay just stopped. 40-something cadets, 3 logistics officers, 2 mechanics mid-argument over a calibration tool, a kitchen unit rolling its way toward the mess corridor. All of it, every single moving thing in that space, went still. I was standing at the observation rail on the upper mezzanine, holding a data slate I hadn't looked at in 20 minutes, watching the transport door cycle open. And she walked out. Let me tell you something about Deathworlders that nobody in the Academy training modules ever really gets right. The files say they're physiologically robust. The health assessment forms have little checkboxes that say enhanced bone density, elevated muscular tension baseline, advanced immune response. The briefing hollows they make you watch during orientation show graphs and percentile curves and comparison charts stacked against standard galactic baseline physiology. None of that prepares you. None of it comes close. Her name was Myra Calloway, 23 years old by human reckoning. Born on Karath Roman 4, which you might know better by its informal designation among the outer cartographers, the Grinder. A planet with 1.4 times standard gravity, an atmospheric pressure that would give a Velhari migraine headache within 4 hours. Weather systems so violent they've been classified separately by 3 different academic institutions, and a biological ecosystem that has been described, without exaggeration, I want to emphasize, without any exaggeration whatsoever, as the most hostile to non-native life in the explored quadrant. She stood in the arrivals bay doorway and looked around, just looked, the way you or I might glance around a room we've walked into 100 times before, casual, unhurried, not nervous, not searching. Just taking inventory, the way someone does when they know they can handle whatever's there. She was tall, not unusually so, maybe a centimeter or 2 above what you'd call average for a human female. But the way she carried herself made her seem larger than she was. Shoulders back, spine straight, weight distributed evenly across both feet. Her hair was pulled away from her face in a plain tie. Her Academy-issue uniform was pressed and fitted correctly, neither too tight nor too loose, the kind of precise fit that told you she'd taken her measurements seriously and submitted them without complaint. She carried 1 bag. Standard Academy-issue duffel, 1 bag for a 5-year posting. Her eyes moved across the arrivals bay slowly, and when they swept past the upper mezzanine where I was standing, I had a strange, slightly embarrassing moment where I straightened up involuntarily, as though being reviewed by a superior officer. She was a new cadet, 1st year, junior intake. I'd been here 2 years. I straightened up anyway. The silence broke about 4 seconds after she stepped fully into the bay. It broke the way silences always break in a space full of young, competitive people, with somebody saying something slightly too loud because they were overcompensating for having gone quiet at all. "Is that a human?" someone said from behind me. I didn't turn around to look. "Deathworlder," someone else said lower, like they were correcting the first speaker. "Same thing." "No, it isn't, not even close." I turned around then, because the conversation was getting the particular edge that conversations at this academy always got when someone didn't understand that being technically correct and being right were occasionally 2 different things. The 2 cadets behind me were both 2nd years, Soren Dax and Pella Orvin. I knew them the way you know everyone at a posting this size, not well, but well enough to recognize the look on both their faces. Soren had that narrow-eyed squint he got when he was trying to seem like he knew more than he did. Pella had her arms crossed and was watching the arrivals bay below with an expression I'd learned to identify as the prelude to her saying something she'd later pretend she hadn't said. "There's a Deathworlder in the junior intake," Soren said, looking at me now, as though I was supposed to react. "I can see her," I said. "They assigned her to Gamma Barracks?" He said it like it was a complaint. I looked back down at the arrivals bay. Myra Calloway was talking to the intake coordinator now, a Veth logistics officer named Prinna who stood about half Myra's shoulder width and was currently leaning slightly further away than their conversation required. Not obviously, just slightly. Myra wasn't noticing, or if she was, she wasn't reacting to it. Good, I said to Soren and meant it, and went back to my data slate. That first week, I watched from a careful, professional distance that I told myself was purely out of academic interest. Academy Kale 9 was not a small posting. It was mid-size by Galactic Defense Network standards, one of 14 integrated training stations scattered across the outer rim, designed to process cadets from multiple species and prepare them for service in the integrated fleet. The design of the station itself was a compromise, the way everything at a multi-species institution was a compromise. The corridors were wide enough for a Brathian cadet in full comfort, which meant they were very wide. The ceiling heights in the common areas accommodated the tallest registered species in the intake roster. The food fabrication units ran 12 distinct dietary protocols simultaneously, and the climate systems maintained a rolling average that nobody was perfectly comfortable with and everyone could technically survive in. Myra Calloway moved through the station like she'd been designed for it, which from a certain physiological perspective she had. Karath Roman 41.4 gravity meant her musculature operated at constant resistance that station standard would have felt like nothing. The atmospheric pressure aboard Kale 9 was, to her, essentially a gentle environment. The temperature control settings that other cadets complained about, too cold at night, too stale in the afternoons, she didn't seem to register at all. She was not the kind of person who made a show of these things. That was what I kept noticing that first week. There was no performance to her. She didn't walk around proving something. She didn't do the thing that some new cadets did, especially those from backgrounds that marked them as unusual, where they either shrink themselves to avoid attention or inflate themselves to own it before anyone can take it from them. She just was what she was. She did her morning assessments before the rest of Gamma Barracks was awake. I know this because I was up early on the third day of the intake cycle, reviewing my shift observation logs in the upper corridor, and I heard the faint, regular rhythm of the equipment room at the far end of the residential wing, the particular sound of someone using the resistance training racks, which require authorization override before 500 standard time. I checked the authorization log when I got to my station terminal an hour later. The override had been logged under Calloway, M Cadet Intake Batch 7G timestamp, 4:02. She'd submitted the access request through proper channels at 2100 the night before, with a note explaining her baseline exercise requirements and requesting accommodation. The note was 3 sentences long. No apology, no over-explanation. Just the relevant facts and the request. The duty officer had approved it. I read that request twice. It was so straightforward it was almost disorienting. By the end of the first week, I had observed several things from my position in the station corridors, mess hall, and training bays. Myra Calloway did not complain about anything. She was not unfriendly. She responded when spoken to. She participated in group assessments when called upon. She ate in the mess hall with other cadets without separating herself or seeking isolation. But she also didn't push. She didn't try to build alliances or insert herself into the social structures that were forming rapidly among the junior intake cadets, the way they always did in those first weeks, the careful maneuvering for position, the pairing off into study partnerships that were really about proximity to the most promising people, the deliberate performances of capability designed to be noticed by senior cadets and eventually by instructors. She sat where there was space. She ate what was available. She contributed to conversations when she had something to say and didn't when she didn't. She was, in the most straightforward sense of the word, a professional, at 23, as a first-year cadet. I found this quietly remarkable. I also found it quietly concerning, for reasons that took me a few more days to fully articulate to myself. The social architecture of a mixed-species academy intake is fragile in a very specific way. You've got cadets from dozens of different backgrounds, different homeworlds, different physiological baselines, different cultural frameworks for authority and hierarchy and proximity and eye contact and silence. You'd think the diversity would be the problem, but it usually isn't, not directly. Most cadets arrive with at least basic multi-species protocol training, the kind that tells you not to interpret a Brathian's lowered crest as aggression when it's actually a greeting, or to maintain at least 0.8 meters of personal space with a Velhari until they offer a closer contact invitation. The problem isn't diversity. The problem is the handful of cadets who decide, in the first week of an intake cycle, that the hierarchy they were used to at home is the one that should apply here, and who start behaving accordingly before anyone has had a chance to establish what the actual order of things is. There were 5 of them, 5 cadets in the junior intake who, by the end of the first week, had settled into a visible cluster. Not a formal group, the academy didn't allow formal intake factions, and they knew better than to make it official. But a cluster. You could see it in the mess hall. They sat together, they walked together between sessions, they spoke in the particular low-voiced murmur of people who are sharing observations about others that they don't want overheard. Their names were Cadet Oren Velak, Cadet Souza Brennar, Cadet Thal, first name not commonly used, Brathian standard single designation, Cadet Pelmanus and Cadet Yinia Sar. 5 cadets. Mixed species, Oren was Velhari, Souza and Pel were human, Thal was Brathian, Yinia was Dacic. 5 cadets who had, in the frictionless way that small social structures sometimes crystallize, become a unit. The unit had decided, also in that frictionless way, that Myra Calloway was unusual in a way that required comment. I heard the first instance of it in the corridor, outside the secondary training bay on day 8. I was coming from the opposite direction, and they hadn't noticed me yet. Oren Velak was talking. He was the one who usually talked, in the center of any group configuration they arranged, and Souza Brennar was nodding along, and Thal was making the Brathian equivalent of the nod, which is a small rhythmic shift of the shoulder carapace. She moved the loading rack in equipment bay 3, Oren was saying. The whole rack, by herself. Those things take 2 Brathian physical standard certifications to operate safely. She probably doesn't know that, Souza said. She moved it without the equipment access protocol, Oren said. No harness, no spotter, no authorization for heavy item movement. Did she break anything? Pel asked. That's not the point, Oren said. I didn't stop walking. I passed them without breaking stride, nodded when Yinia Sar made eye contact, and continued around the corner toward my own destination. But I slowed my pace around the corner and listened for another 10 seconds. Someone should say something, Oren said. To who? Thal asked. Silence, then Oren again, quieter. Not to the administration, just she should know. I didn't like that. She should know is how a certain kind of problem almost always starts. The second week was when things began to shift in a direction I couldn't quite name, but could feel very clearly. Myra's performance in the physical assessment rotations was, to put it in the careful language of official academy records, exceptional across all measured parameters. The assessment rotations were designed with multi-species baselines in mind. The scoring accounted for physiological differences, so a Brathian cadet and a human cadet were being assessed against adjusted expectations for their respective baseline categories. Except that Myra's physiological baseline wasn't standard human. It was Karath Roman for human, which is, and I am not using metaphorical language here, a different category of physical capability. She wasn't dramatically exceeding the assessments. That was the thing. She wasn't burning through them in some spectacular way that would have drawn everyone's attention at once. She was just, steadily, consistently, completely finishing everything placed in front of her with a margin to spare that was, if you were watching carefully, impossible to account for under normal expectations. The obstacle course that averaged 12 minutes for the top quartile of standard human intake. She ran it in 9 minutes 40 seconds on the first attempt, in the wrong boots. Someone had mislabeled the equipment locker, and she'd been assigned a size that didn't fit correctly. She'd said nothing about the boots. She'd just run the course. The endurance pressure simulation that typically took cadets 3 to 4 sessions to pass. She cleared it on her second session, would have cleared it on her first except that she'd been paired with a Dacic cadet who needed a partner assist partway through, and she'd stopped to provide it without hesitation, which pushed her personal time over the threshold. The combat assessment, which is, technically, a scored readiness evaluation, not actual combat, the Academy is very clear about the distinction. She declined to go above the minimum demonstration threshold for the first 3 rotations. I noticed that. It wasn't because she couldn't do more. I watched how she moved during those assessments. She was being careful. She was showing enough to demonstrate competency and not 1 gram more. She was calibrating. She understood, at some instinctive level that I found professionally impressive and personally a little unnerving, exactly how much visibility she wanted to have. The 5 cadets in Oren's cluster were not professional observers. They were competitive 20-year-olds in a high-pressure intake environment, and what they were feeling, which I could read in their posture, their expressions, their slightly too fast responses in group settings when Myra was present, was a specific and uncomfortable thing. They were threatened, not physically, academically, hierarchically. They had, in that first week, arranged themselves according to a certain expected order of things, and Myra's presence didn't fit that order and wasn't trying to. And that was, for reasons that had everything to do with their own insecurities and nothing to do with anything Myra had done, infuriating. I recognized this because I had been watching academy intake cycles for 2 years, and this particular dynamic was not new. It showed up in almost every cohort in some form. The details changed. The faces changed. The species composition of the cluster changed. But the underlying mechanism was the same. A group of people who had organized themselves around a certain idea of where they stood, confronting someone whose existence suggested the map was wrong. What I didn't predict, what I should have predicted but didn't, and I've thought about that failure many times since, was how quickly it would move from glances and low-voiced conversations to something that required the commander's direct attention. The med bay at Station KL-9 was on the 4th ring, in the inner arc, separated from the training quadrants by 2 airlocks and a climate transition zone. The transition zone existed because the med bay was maintained at a slightly different atmospheric composition than the rest of the station. Elevated oxygen ratio, reduced particulates, specific humidity range to support recovery conditions for the widest range of registered species in the current intake roster. I ended up at the med bay on a completely unrelated matter. I had a minor nerve irritation in my left shoulder from a training harness fitting error 3 days earlier, the kind of thing that isn't serious but gets more irritating the longer you wait, and I'd been waiting longer than I should have. I submitted the med bay appointment request on a Thursday morning and was slotted in for 1600 that afternoon. I arrived at 1558 and was directed to a waiting area with 4 chairs and a low-output ambient light panel that was doing something gentle to the color temperature of the room, presumably to keep waiting patients calm. There was a small refreshment unit in the corner. I sat down, set my data slate on the arm of the chair, and started reviewing the observation logs I'd been meaning to get through since Tuesday. At 1612, Myra Calloway came through the med bay entrance. She was carrying her left arm slightly differently from her right, not dramatically, not in the way someone who was injured and aware they needed to project normality sometimes overcorrects. Just differently. The way a person carries an arm when moving it hurts, and they've accepted that it hurts, and are managing it without letting it change the rest of their posture. She checked in at the intake terminal, took the open chair 2 seats away from me, and sat down. She nodded when she noticed me. We'd been in the same upper corridor observation area twice in the past week, and she'd registered my presence both times in that way she had of registering things, fully, without making a production of it. "Shoulder?" I asked, because sometimes the most useful thing is to just say the obvious thing. "Collarbone region," she said. "Probably just a deep tissue bruise, the scanner will confirm." Training. Loading dock simulation. The resistance calibration on the secondary harness system was set for Brathian standard. I should have checked it before I ran the sim. She said this with zero self-pity. Just a straightforward account of what had happened and what she should have done differently. Those systems should be recalibrated automatically when the operator logs their species designation, I said. "They are," she said. "I logged human." "But, Carathroman 4 human. The system doesn't have a separate calibration protocol for planetary variant human physiologies." She said it flatly. "It's a known gap. There's a standing request in the equipment maintenance queue for a Carathroman 4 specific parameter set. It's been in the queue for 8 months. I looked at her. 8 months. The station has 4 registered Carathroman 4 cadets in the past 3 intake cycles. I'm the first in the current cycle. It's a low-priority queue item." She paused. "I put in my own request this morning, CC'd the equipment officer and the medical liaison." "That was the right thing to do," I said. "It's just the obvious thing," she said. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes. I went back to my data slate. She sat with her back straight and her right hand resting on her knee and looked at the ambient light panel with an expression of entirely neutral patience. The med bay door opened at 16:19. 5 cadets walked in. I recognized them immediately. Oren Velak first, then Souza Brennar just behind his right shoulder, then Pel Manus, then Thal in the wider entrance gap, then Yini Asar bringing up the back. They weren't in appointment slots. I knew this because the intake terminal blinked its scheduling indicator when they came through, a pattern that meant walk-in inquiry, not scheduled visit. They saw Myra the same moment. I fully registered what was happening. Oren stopped just far enough inside the entrance that the door cycled shut behind the group. He looked at Myra with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed. It had the particular quality of something that had been planned, not in specific detail, maybe, but in broad terms. He'd known she was here, or he'd known she'd be somewhere like this, and he'd found out where. "Calloway," he said. Myra looked up. She looked at all 5 of them in sequence, the same slow, complete inventory she'd done in the arrivals bay on day 1. Then she looked back at Oren. "Velak," she said. The neutrality in her voice was extraordinary. Not hostile, not cautious, not trying to signal anything, just neutral. The word was a response to being addressed, nothing more. "You're in the med bay," Oren said. "I have an appointment," she said. "We wanted to talk to you." He moved slightly further into the room, not aggressively, but with the deliberate ease of someone claiming space. The others arranged themselves in a loose arc, not surrounding her, nothing that obvious, just there in the room, positioned. I had set my data slate face down on the chair arm. I was watching. "We can talk," Myra said. She didn't move from her chair. She didn't shift her posture to acknowledge the configuration they'd arranged themselves in. She just sat, spine straight, left arm resting slightly more carefully than her right. "There have been some concerns," Oren said. He had the particular cadence of someone who had rehearsed an opening line and was now executing it. "Among the intake cohort, about some of the things you've been doing in the training bays." "What things?" Myra asked. "The loading rack incident," Souza said, jumping in. Her voice was faster than Oren's, less controlled. "The one in Equipment Bay 3, you moved a Category 4 rack without authorization. Without the safety equipment. I moved it to the calibrated position it was supposed to be in," Myra said. "The previous user had left it obstructing the emergency egress path, which is a safety violation. I logged the correction in the equipment activity record." "You're not certified for Category 4 manual movement," Pel said. "I'm certified for Category 6 manual movement on Karathroman 4 standard," Myra said. "The application for Kale 9 certification equivalency is in the training office queue. It was submitted on my intake form." There was a pause. Oren's rehearsed cadence stumbled very slightly. He hadn't known about the certification equivalency. "There's also the assessment scores," Thal said. Thal's voice was lower than the others. Brathian vocal registers run deeper than most, and there's a resonance to them that can read as threatening even when the speaker is being entirely conversational. "Your physical assessments. They're outside the expected range for a standard human intake baseline." "I'm not a standard human baseline," Myra said. She said it simply, without apology and without aggression. "That information is in my intake documentation." "It concerns the other cadets," Yinia said. This was the first time Yinia had spoken. Yinia Sar was Dacic, a slender, pale species with wide sensory receptor eyes that tend to unsettle people who weren't used to them, because the pupils move differently from most registered species, and the tracking can feel uncanny. When a Dacic looks directly at you and speaks in measured tones, there's a quality to it that can feel like a judgment being handed down. When one cadet operates outside the established parameters, it creates instability in the cohort dynamic. "Instability," Myra said. "Yes," Yinia said. "People feel uncertain, they don't know what to expect." "That sounds like a feeling management problem," Myra said, "not an operational problem." Nobody said anything for a moment. I was completely still. I had years of academy experience telling me exactly what I was watching. A confrontation dressed up as a welfare visit. A power play executed by people who'd convinced themselves it was a reasonable conversation. I knew I should say something. I also knew with equal clarity that Myra Calloway was handling this better than anything I could offer, and that intervening might actually make it worse by suggesting she needed intervention. "We're not here to attack you," Oren said. He'd recovered his rehearsed cadence. "We're genuinely expressing concerns on behalf of the cohort." "Who designated you to represent the cohort?" Myra asked. Oren blinked. "What?" "Who in the cohort designated you to speak on their behalf?" she said. "Was there a meeting, a vote, an authorization process?" "It's not formal." "Then you're expressing your own concerns," she said, "and calling them cohort concerns to give them institutional weight they don't have." The silence in the med bay was very thorough. The ambient light panel hummed at its usual frequency. The environmental system cycled through its regular exchange. Outside the window panel, the sector's starfield was doing nothing in particular. Oren Velak looked at Myra Calloway for a long moment. Then he looked at Souza, who looked back at him with an expression I couldn't fully read from my angle. Then Thal made the shoulder carapace movement that in Brathian nonverbal communication indicates something between discomfort and reassessment. "You're not trying to be a part of this cohort," Oren said. His voice had changed. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was underneath it was younger, rower, more honest, and more troubling. "You don't participate." "You don't." "I participate in every required component of the training program," Myra said. "I eat in the mess hall. I complete group assessments. I respond when I'm addressed. I don't participate in social structures that are organized to establish hierarchies that aren't sanctioned by the Academy's actual command structure. That's not the same as not participating." "You think you're better than us?" Souza said. This one came out sharp and hot without the careful pacing of the rest. Raw emotion right at the surface. Myra looked at Souza for a moment. The look wasn't contemptuous. It wasn't triumphant. It was something more complicated, something that took me a moment to identify, and when I did, it surprised me. It was tired. Not exhausted, not defeated, just the tiredness of someone who has had this conversation before, in different rooms, with different faces, in different words, and knows exactly where every path through it leads. "No," Myra said. "I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm different from you in ways that are clearly making you uncomfortable, and I think you're trying to address that discomfort by convincing me to become more like you, and I'm not going to do that. That's not arrogance. It's just honesty." She paused for a single breath. "If you have specific operational concerns, things I'm doing that create safety risks or violate protocol, I genuinely want to hear them and address them. If what you have are feelings about my presence, those feelings are valid, but they're not my responsibility to manage." She turned back to face the front of the room, the way you do when a conversation is over. It was one of the cleanest, most precise conflict de-escalations I'd ever watched anyone execute, and she was 23 years old, and she'd done it from a chair with a bruised collarbone without raising her voice once. "Here's where I need to tell you what I missed. Because I was watching the conversation. I was watching Myra, and I was watching Oren, and I was categorizing what was happening and noting the de-escalation and thinking, quietly and professionally, that this was going to be fine, that she'd handled it, that they would leave now and the situation would resolve. I missed Pel Manus. Pel had been standing to the left of the group, Oren's left, which put him partially behind Oren's shoulder from my viewing angle in the waiting area. He was the one who'd spoken about the certification. He was shorter than the others, broader in the shoulder for a human, with a quick, slightly pinched quality to his facial expressions that I'd noticed in group settings before but hadn't thought about much. He stepped forward. Not a dramatic step, not a lunge. Just a step closing the space between the group and Myra's chair by maybe half a meter. A deliberate, testing step, the kind that says, "I'm still here. This isn't done." "You don't get to just," he started. And Myra moved. "I want to be precise about what happened because I've thought about it many times and I want to be accurate. She didn't stand up. She didn't reach for him. She didn't do anything aggressive or preparatory or threatening in the standard sense. She just shifted her center of gravity. It was a fractional movement, a degree or two of change in how her weight was distributed across the chair. A slight adjustment of her right hand from her knee to the chair arm. Almost nothing. Pel Manus stopped moving. He stopped the way you stop when you've been walking down a corridor, and you notice, a split second before your foot lands, that there's a step you didn't see, that involuntary arrest of motion that bypasses conscious decision-making entirely and lives in the animal brain. He stopped and stood very still, and his expression changed in a way I don't quite have words for. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the cellular, pre-linguistic recognition that something in the equation has changed, and you're not sure how, and your body has decided to wait for more information before committing to any direction. I wasn't finished, Myra said, quietly. She looked at Pell directly. I said that if you have operational concerns, I want to hear them. I meant it. Do you have an operational concern? Pell said nothing. If you're going to step toward me in a medical facility where I have an injury, Myra said, still quietly, you should understand that I am going to notice that and I am going to respond appropriately. That's not a threat. That's information. The silence held for another 4 seconds. I counted. Then the med bay door opened. Commander Adras Solen was not a person who appeared places at convenient moments by accident. She was 51 years old, standard galactic reckoning, which for a Veth-human hybrid translated to approximately the peak of professional acuity before the long plateau of late career. She was the commanding officer of Station Kale 9, which she'd held for 7 years, making her the second longest-serving commander in the station's operational history. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing in any conventional sense. She had gray-threaded hair cut practically short and eyes the color of deep water in low light, and she carried herself with the particular kind of stillness that comes from having nothing left to prove. She walked into the med bay the way she walked everywhere, without fanfare, without hurry, without any signal that her arrival was an event worth marking. She had a data slate under her left arm and a travel thermos of something warm in her right hand, and she looked, at first glance, like someone who'd simply taken a wrong turn on the way to somewhere else. She took in the scene in the med bay in less than 2 seconds. I know this because her expression didn't change, which meant she'd processed everything visible and categorized it before the door had fully finished cycling closed. The 5 cadets turned toward her. Myra turned her head enough to register the arrival without fully repositioning. Cadets, the commander said, neutral level. Commander Solen, Oren said. He'd snapped to the formal attention posture, the appropriate response when a commanding officer enters a space without warning. The others followed. The commander walked to the refreshment unit in the corner, filled her thermos cap, and took a slow sip. The sequence of these actions had the quality of something deliberate, not a performance of ease exactly, but a demonstration that she was operating on her own schedule. She looked at the 5 cadets over the rim of the cap. Are any of you here for medical appointments? She asked. No, Commander, Sousa said. Wellness check, Oren tried. It came out smaller than he'd intended. On Cadet Calloway, the commander said. Nobody answered. The answer was obvious and they all knew it. Cadet Calloway, the commander said. Do you require a wellness check from these 5 individuals? No, Commander, Myra said. Are you here for a scheduled medical appointment? Yes, Commander. 1600 slot, I'm waiting. The commander nodded. She looked back at the 5 cadets. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her expression significantly. What she did was set her thermos cap down on the refreshment unit with a very deliberate quietness and look at each of the 5 cadets in turn, not quickly, not a scan, but a full individual look that lasted long enough for each of them to feel it specifically. The 5 of you are going to walk out of this med bay now, she said. You are going to return to your respective barracks assignments, and you are going to remain there until 700 tomorrow, at which point you will report to my office. The 5 of you, together. 700, not 701, not 702. You'll have an opportunity to explain to me why you chose to spend your unscheduled time this afternoon in the medical facility. A pause. You are dismissed. They left, quickly. All 5 in close succession, with the particular rapid compliance of people who have belatedly understood that things have become significantly more serious than they'd planned. The door cycled shut. The commander picked up her thermos cap again and took another sip. She looked at me. Cadet Vasquez, she said. Commander, are you here for a medical appointment as well? Yes, Commander, shoulder. She nodded, then she looked at Myra. Cadet Calloway. While you're waiting, and it looks like you'll be waiting a few more minutes because Dr. Preth is finishing a diagnostic, I'd like to sit with you for a moment, if that's acceptable. Myra looked at her, a short, assessing look. Yes, Commander. The commander took the chair between us. She set her thermos on the arm, crossed one ankle over her knee, and settled in the way a person settles when they mean to stay for a bit. "How's the station treating you so far?" she asked. "The equipment calibration protocols have some gaps for Karathroman 4 physiological parameters," Myra said. "I've submitted requests through appropriate channels." "I saw those requests this morning," the commander said. "They've been elevated to priority status." "That was fast." "Some things should have been done 8 months ago," the commander said, with a directness that was, somehow, neither an apology nor an excuse, just an acknowledgement. Myra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The collarbone region injury is likely because the harness resistance was calibrated for Brathian standard. I should have verified it manually before running the simulation." "You should have, yes," the commander said. "You also shouldn't have had to. The system should have prevented that mismatch at the point of intake log. Both things are true. One of them was in your control today. One wasn't." Myra looked at the commander with an expression I'd been trying to read for 2 weeks, and finally had context for. It was the expression of someone who was measuring, very carefully, whether the person they were talking to was the kind of person worth trusting with the honest version of things. "That's the first time someone here has said that," Myra said, "that both things can be true." "It's a reasonably basic concept," the commander said. "People often find it difficult." "They do," Myra said. She looked at her left arm for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Did you know they were going to be here?" The commander took a sip from her thermos. "I was made aware, 22 minutes ago, that a group of junior intake cadets were moving in the direction of the medical wing without scheduled appointments. I take an interest in patterns of unscheduled movement during intake periods. In my experience, they tend to indicate something worth paying attention to." "And you came yourself," Myra said, "not a duty officer." "I came myself," the commander confirmed. I sat very still in my chair, feeling, for the first time in 2 weeks, that I was watching something that I wouldn't forget. I wasn't in the commander's office the next morning. Obviously, I was a cadet observer, not an officer of record, and the 700 meeting was not mine to attend. But I know what happened in it, because the station is not large, and because one of the 5 cadets who were in that office is someone I've spoken with many times since. Someone who, years later, in a very different context, over a meal that had nothing to do with this story, told me what was said in that room. The 5 of them arrived together on time and stood in the formal arrangement appropriate for 5 cadets reporting to a commanding officer. The commander was already behind her desk. She had no data slate in front of her. She had her hands folded on the desk surface, and she looked at them for a long moment before she said anything. What she said, in the account I was given, was this: "I've reviewed the circumstances of yesterday's incident. I've reviewed your intake assessments, your training performance records, and your behavioral logs for the first 2 weeks of the intake cycle. I want to be clear with you about what I observed, and then I want to give you an opportunity to tell me what you observed. After that, we're going to talk about consequences. Not because consequences are the point, but because understanding precedes consequence, and I won't assign one without the other." She paused. "Then what I observed is that 5 junior intake cadets, all of whom are performing at or above their respective individual baseline expectations, which means you're all capable, chose to use unscheduled time to confront a fellow cadet in a medical facility. Not during a training session, not during an authorized assessment, in a medical facility, where she had a scheduled appointment, while she was waiting with an injury." Another pause. "I want you to understand what that looks like from where I sit. It doesn't look like concern. It looks like intimidation. And if it looks like intimidation from this desk, I promise you it looked like intimidation to Cadet Calloway. The question I want you to answer, before we talk about anything else, is whether that was your intention." Silence, then Oren said it wasn't their intention. The commander asked what their intention was. Oren said they had concerns about Cadet Calloway's behavior in the training bays. The commander asked, had those concerns been submitted through proper channels? No. Had they been raised with any officer or supervisor? No. Had they, at any point, checked whether the concerns they had were based on accurate information about Cadet Calloway's documentation, certification status, and intake authorizations? No. The commander nodded. She said, "So you had feelings," which, to be absolutely clear, are valid. Feelings are not the problem, and instead of processing those feelings through any of the numerous appropriate structures this station provides for exactly this purpose, you took them directly to the source of your discomfort and delivered them in a context designed to maximize your group's social pressure. Nobody said anything. That is, the commander said, a significant lapse in judgment, not a small one, not a forgivable oversight, a significant lapse. And I need you to understand why, because this is a training station for an integrated fleet, and in an integrated fleet, that kind of lapse gets people hurt. Not here, not today, but in the field, in the situations you're training for. When you operate on unverified information in a high-pressure context, using social pressure instead of established process, you create exactly the kind of conditions that cost lives. She let that sit for a moment. The 5 of you are going to do the following things, she then said. First, your training schedule for the next 2 weeks is suspended. Not canceled, suspended. You will spend those 2 weeks in a structured reflection assignment, which will involve reviewing case studies of operational failures that trace back to the kind of in-group social dynamics you've been running here, and submitting written assessments of each case. Second, you will each individually, in writing and through proper channels, submit any operational concerns you have about any fellow cadet's training behavior, for review by the appropriate officer. Third, you will have no unsanctioned contact with Cadet Calloway for the remainder of the intake cycle. That means no informal interaction, no group approaches, no third-party communication. If Cadet Calloway initiates contact with any of you, you may respond appropriately. If she does not, you leave her alone. A pause. Fourth, the commander said, and this is the one I'm going to ask you to take seriously beyond the procedural requirements. I want you to think very carefully about what happened yesterday. Not what you did, that's covered. I want you to think about why you did it. What you were actually feeling, and where that feeling came from, and whether the story you were telling yourself about Cadet Calloway matched anything in the actual documented facts of her behavior. Because in my experience, when a group of capable people do something this far outside appropriate norms, it's rarely because they're bad people. It's usually because they're scared. And there's no shame in being scared. But there is a problem when scared people mistake a colleague for a threat. The account I was given said there was a very long silence after that. Long enough that it stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. The particular quality of a silence in which something that was said is actually being absorbed. Then Sousa said, "We didn't know about the certifications." "No," the commander said. "You didn't, you assumed." "We didn't know she'd submitted the harness calibration request," Pell said. "No, you didn't look." Oren started and stopped. The commander waited. "She's not what I expected," Oren said. "I don't," he stopped again. "That's not a good reason." "No," the commander said. "It's not, but it's honest. I appreciate honest more than I appreciate polished." She unfolded her hands and picked up her thermos. "You're dismissed. The reflection assignment brief will be in your inboxes by 800. I expect the first assessment submitted by end of week." They left. And one of them, I won't say which one, because that detail belongs to the person, stopped at the door and turned around and said, "Should we apologize to her?" The commander considered this for a moment. "That's between you and your conscience," she said. "But if you do it, make it real. Don't do it because you think it's required. Do it because you've actually thought about it." The door closed. Here is something I have come to believe in the years since that intake cycle. The incident in the med bay was not the important part of the story. I know that sounds strange, because the incident is what everyone who tells this story focuses on. 5 cadets, the med bay confrontation, the commander walking in, that's the shape of it when it gets compressed into a summary. And it's a good summary. It's accurate in the events it describes. But the important part, the part that actually changed things, that happened over the following weeks and months, in smaller moments, in adjustments and recalibrations and things that were said and not said, and then eventually said differently. Let me tell you about some of those moments. Oren Velak's reflection assignment covered 14 case studies over 2 weeks. I know this because 3 months later he referenced specific cases in a training session I was supervising. He had actually read them, not skimmed them, not processed them for the minimum viable summary, actually read them, thought about them, connected them to what had happened in the med bay. He told me not in any official capacity, just in a corridor conversation after a session. that the third case study had stopped him completely. It was a case from a Velhari fleet posting, 30 years back, where a social pressure dynamic within a tactical unit had led to an operational decision being made on faulty assumptions, because no one in the group felt safe questioning the group's consensus. 3 officers had died. The inquiry afterward had traced the entire chain of events back to a single moment in the 6th week of that unit's deployment, where a member who had different information from the group's accepted narrative had been socially pressured into silence. The thing I kept thinking, Oren told me, was that nobody in that unit thought they were doing anything wrong. They thought they were maintaining unit cohesion. That's what scared me, because that's what I thought I was doing. I didn't say anything for a moment. Cohesion built on everyone being the same is fragility dressed up as strength, I finally said. He thought about that. Yeah, he said, that's what I keep coming back to. Sousa Brennar was the one who eventually apologized to Myra, about 6 weeks after the Med Bay. I wasn't there for it. I heard about it afterward, from neither party, which is usually how the truest version of these things travels. The way I heard it, they'd been paired on a technical assessment. The station's administrative system hadn't been told about the no-contact guideline when it assigned assessment partners, and by the time anyone caught it, the assessment was already underway. They'd completed the assessment without incident. Then, afterward, apparently in the corridor outside the assessment bay, Sousa had said something to the effect of, "I was wrong about what I said in the Med Bay. I was scared, and I made it your problem, and that wasn't fair." Myra had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I know, thank you." That was the account, short, no dramatics, just an honest thing said and an honest thing heard. They weren't close after that, they weren't friends. But they were colleagues in the actual functional sense, people who could work in the same space and complete shared tasks and communicate when it was needed. That is, sometimes, the most you can reasonably hope for. Thal, the Brathian cadet, had the strangest evolution of all 5. Thal, by Brathian cultural norms, had significant standing within any multi-species group, simply by virtue of being Brathian. Brathian are one of the founding species of the integrated fleet framework. There's a long history and a certain institutional prestige that attaches to them. Thal had never had to think very hard about where they stood in a room. Myra Calloway, by her existence and her behavior, had introduced a situation Thal didn't have a cultural framework for. Someone whose capability exceeded Thal's in measurable ways that had nothing to do with the existing hierarchy. Thal told me this directly, in one of the clearest and most self-aware conversations I've ever had with a 20-year-old. We were in the upper observation deck late one evening, both there for unrelated reasons, and Thal started talking in the way people sometimes talk when they've been thinking about something for a long time, and they've finally built up enough structure around it to say it out loud. "I went to the Med Bay," Thal said, "because I thought I was protecting order, a thing I understood and was comfortable inside of. I was going to explain to her where she fit, because where she was fitting didn't make sense in the order I knew." A long pause. "She wasn't fitting into my order because my order was too small for her. That's not the same thing as her not belonging. I made that mistake." "A lot of people make that mistake," I said. "Brathian are trained to make it less than most," Thal said. "That makes it worse." I didn't contradict that. It was accurate. Pelmanus was the last of the 5 I understood. He was also the one who had stepped forward in the Med Bay, that half-meter step that had stopped when Myra shifted her weight, and that step was the detail he carried. Not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened. But he knew what the step was, and he'd felt what it felt like when the equation changed. He submitted a formal report, through proper channels, about the harness calibration failure that had injured Myra's collarbone region. He gathered the equipment logs, pulled the maintenance queue records, documented the 8-month gap in the Karath Roman 4 parameter set request. He wrote it clearly and submitted it to the station's equipment officer and the safety committee. He did this without telling anyone he was doing it. I found out because the safety committee chairperson mentioned it in passing during a routine observation briefing 3 weeks later. Mentioned it as an example of a junior cadet doing something right, filing a proper equipment safety report that had allowed the committee to elevate the calibration gap to urgent priority and complete the parameter update within 10 days. I don't know if Pell did it because he felt guilty. I don't know if he did it because he genuinely cared about the equipment safety gap. I think it was probably both, tangled together in the way things usually are. But the report was real, and the result was real, and every cadet who ran that harness simulation after it was done was running it on correctly calibrated equipment. Yinia Sar's evolution was the quietest. Yinia said almost nothing in public for about a month after the med bay. In assessments, in the mess hall, in group settings, present, compliant, fully functional, but quiet in a way that was noticeably different from Yinia's usual measured precision. About 5 weeks out, Yinia approached Myra in the equipment bay, in the open, in the middle of the training day, in front of about a dozen other cadets who were running their own assessments. Approached directly, without group backup, without preparation. Just walked up and said, "I want to ask you something." Myra said yes. Yinia said, "What does it feel like, being the only one of what you are in a room?" Myra was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Quiet." Yinia thought about that. "I meant, doesn't it make you angry? That no one has set things up correctly for you?" "Sometimes," Myra said, "less useful than solving it." Yinia nodded slowly. "I think I understand that," Yinia said, "less than I should." "You can learn," Myra said. "Yes," Yinia said, "I'm working on it." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two people from wildly different backgrounds, in a room full of other people who were watching without appearing to watch, standing next to each other in the particular proximity of two people who have decided to figure something out. I should tell you about Myra Calloway herself, in the part of the story that doesn't involve being confronted or witnessed or observed by anyone else. Because the thing I spent most of that intake cycle watching was not actually the 5 cadets or the commander or the social dynamics of the group. It was Myra. Not in any intrusive way, I want to be clear about that. Not with any agenda or documentation purpose. Just the ongoing awareness that I was in the presence of someone who was quietly demonstrating something I hadn't seen demonstrated that clearly before, and I didn't want to miss it. She did not change in response to what happened. That's the first thing. She didn't become more cautious or more guarded or more careful about visibility. She didn't soften her behavior to be more palatable. She didn't harden it to prove a point. She continued doing exactly what she'd been doing since day one, meeting each requirement, addressing each problem, communicating what was necessary and nothing extraneous. She also didn't pretend it hadn't happened. She didn't perform being unaffected. In the days after the med bay, in the training bays and the corridors and the mess hall, there was something that I can only describe as a slight increase in intentionality, as though she'd processed what had happened and extracted from it a calibration she hadn't needed before. She was slightly more precise in her interactions, slightly more deliberate in her communication, not defensive, just clear. As though she'd taken the temperature of the environment and adjusted her outputs accordingly. I asked her about it once, late in the intake cycle, in the upper observation deck. We'd both ended up there around 2100. I'd been finishing logs. She'd been doing something with a star chart she was apparently making for her own reference, a manual one, which I'd never seen anyone do in the digital era, and which she was doing with a physical stylus and a printout. "The chart," I said, because I couldn't not ask. "I mapped them myself," she said. "The Karath Roman 4 sky is different from the standard galactic reference charts. Different angle of reference. My whole childhood I navigated by a slightly different set of positions. The standard charts still feel off," she considered. "Off isn't quite right, just not mine." "So you make your own?" "I keep the standard one too," she said. "You have to." "But I keep mine alongside it." I thought about that for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "After the med bay, was any of it hard?" She looked at me. The look lasted long enough that I thought she was going to redirect the question or deflect it. She didn't. "The part where Sousa said I thought I was better than them," she said. "That one landed, because I've heard it before, and every time I hear it, there's a moment where I have to check whether it's true. Whether I've actually done something that reads as contempt or superiority, or whether someone is translating different from me as thinks they're above me. And the check always comes out the same way, but it still takes something." "It does," I said. "The other part," she said, "the part where Pell stepped forward," she stopped. "He didn't realize what he was doing, I know that. He wasn't planning to do anything. But your body responds to things before your mind catches up, and my body has been trained on a planet where things that move toward you without warning have a very specific meaning, to respond in a specific way." She paused. "I didn't hurt him. I wasn't going to hurt him." but the awareness of the gap between what my training prepares me for and what this situation actually was, that was uncomfortable. Your training being Karath Roman 4 survival response standard, I asked. My training being 23 years of living in a place that will kill you if you go soft, she said. That doesn't turn off, it accommodates. It learns context, but it doesn't turn off. I thought about that for a long time after. Part 7, What the Commander Knew. I didn't understand, until much later, the full scope of what Commander Adras Solen had done the day she walked into the med bay. I understood the immediate actions. Walk in, observe, remove the 5 cadets, create space. That was clear. What I didn't understand was the conversation she'd had with her deputy officer at 800 that morning. A conversation I know about because the deputy officer, Commander Preth, told me about it 3 years after the fact, when we were both at a very different posting, and the story had become the kind of thing that gets told as a reference point. Commander Solen had known, at 800 on the day of the med bay, that Cadet Calloway was going to be targeted. Not in the specific detail, not 5 cadets, the med bay, 1612. But she knew the shape of it. She'd read the equipment movement report and the certification request and the early morning training authorization, and she'd read the social dynamics of the junior intake the way she'd been reading intake dynamics for 7 years, and she'd understood exactly what was building. She'd had options. She could have called Oren Velak's group in individually or collectively in the morning and addressed it before it happened. She could have assigned them to additional supervised sessions that would have occupied their afternoon. She could have had a duty officer posted at the med bay entrance. She'd done none of those things. She said, Preth told me, that if she intervened before it happened, she would stop it from happening once. But she wouldn't stop it from happening again in a different form in a different place, because the 5 cadets would have had the confrontation they needed to have removed from them before they could understand why it was wrong. She said, I need them to walk into that room themselves. I need them to hear Calloway speak directly to them. I need them to be the ones who make that choice, so that they can be the ones who understand what the choice was. Preth paused in the telling, and she said she needed Calloway to handle it, because Calloway was going to spend her entire career being the person in the room who handles it, and the first time she did it needed to be hers. Not managed from outside. Hers. I thought about that for a long time, too. There is a postscript to this story, which takes place 18 months after the Med Bay incident. The 5 cadets and Myra Calloway were assigned, in year 2 of the intake cycle's second stage, to a field simulation exercise that required 6-person team coordination in a high-pressure tactical scenario. The assignment was made by the simulation system based on skills assessment and team composition optimization. Whether the commander had any influence over the algorithm that generated that assignment, I cannot say. The algorithm results were flagged as standard output. The simulation involved a scenario in which a team was responding to a multiple casualty event in a compromised environment, partial atmospheric failure, structural damage, active secondary hazard, limited time window. It was one of the harder simulations on the rotation. It had a first attempt pass rate of about 40% for 6-person teams, and the common failure mode was a communication breakdown in the second phase when the secondary hazard escalated. This team passed it on the first attempt. Their time was in the top 8% of all recorded attempts for that simulation. The debrief records noted exceptional communication across team members. Notable performance from Cadet Calloway, tactical lead, structural assessment and heavy extraction operations, and Cadet Velak, comms coordination and decision relay. Team demonstrated unusual coherence under second phase pressure escalation. Unusual coherence is the Academy's very restrained way of saying something remarkable happened. The tactical lead role, the one Myra had held, is typically the highest stress position in that simulation. It requires the person holding it to make rapid sequential decisions with incomplete information, maintain communication with all 5 other team members simultaneously, and execute physical operations in the compromised environment while doing both of those things. Oren Velak held the comms coordination role, the one that required him to relay Myra's decisions clearly and accurately to the rest of the team, without interpretation, without editing, without delay. He did this correctly, every time under pressure, for the full duration of the simulation. I thought about the corridor conversation we'd had 3 months after the med bay. the case study about the Velhari tactical unit. The 3 officers who had died because someone with different information couldn't speak over the group consensus. Oren had read that case study. He had been standing in a simulation, relaying the decisions of someone he had once walked into a medical facility to confront, without hesitation, without editorializing, because those decisions were correct and his job was to relay them. I think that's the shape of the actual story, when you back up far enough to see it whole. Epilogue, the equipment bay, late evening. 6 weeks after the simulation debrief, I was in the equipment bay after hours, doing a log review that had run longer than planned. The lights were on low-efficiency setting, the kind that leaves the far corners of the room in shadow and makes everything feel slightly amber and quiet. Myra was there. She'd been there before I arrived. She was at the far end of the bay doing something with the recalibrated harness system, not running a simulation, just working through the harness configuration manually, the way someone does when they want to understand a piece of equipment from the inside out, learning it. I watched her for a moment before she noticed me. She was completely absorbed, not performing focus, actually absorbed, the kind of deep attention that doesn't leave room for peripheral awareness. Her hands moved through the harness fittings with the particular care of someone who has made a decision to trust a system that hurt them before and is building that trust deliberately, component by component. She noticed me after a minute and straightened up. "Late session?" I asked. "Just getting familiar," she said. We were quiet for a moment. The environmental system cycled. The amber light held steady. "You're going to be very good at this," I said finally. Not a compliment exactly. More like an observation that I'd been sitting with for a while and had decided deserved to be said. She looked at me, that same measuring look, whether the honest version was worth offering. "I know," she said, and she meant it without arrogance, without boast, without performance of any kind. She said it the way she said everything, as a plain fact that she'd assessed and arrived at and was neither embarrassed by nor inflated by. "That doesn't scare you?" I asked. Knowing and still having to prove it to everyone, every time in every room. She thought about this for a moment. Her hands rested on the harness fitting. The amber light made the equipment room look older and warmer than it was. "The proving part isn't what I'm thinking about," she said. "I'm thinking about what I can actually do when I know how to do it correctly. The proving part is just background noise." She turned back to the harness and continued working. I stood there for another minute, watching her hands move through the fittings with that same deliberate patience. Then I picked up my data slate and headed for the door. The equipment bay was quiet behind me, just the sound of someone learning how to trust the equipment that had hurt them, methodically and without complaint, getting it right. Senior Cadet Observation Officer Ren Vasquez completed their posting at Station Kale 9 in year 2389 of the Galactic Standard Calendar. Cadet Myra Calloway completed her intake cycle in the top 3 percentile of all measured parameters for her year cohort. Her first field posting placed her as Structural and Tactical Specialist with the 14th Integrated Response Division, Outer Rim. She received commendation for operations on 3 separate occasions in her first 18 months of deployment. 5 cadets from the Kale 9 year 2387 junior intake went on to serve in the integrated fleet. Their records are unremarkable in the way that solid, reliable, thoughtful officers' records tend to be. No dramatic failures, no spectacular crises. Just the quiet, consistent work of people who learned, before they graduated, the difference between feeling threatened and being in danger. Commander Adras Solen remained at Station Kale 9 for another 4 years before accepting a senior command posting. Her tenure as the longest-serving commander in the station's history was eventually exceeded by her successor. The Karath-Roman 4 physiological parameter set for equipment calibration at Station Kale 9 was completed, tested, and certified 11 days after the Safety Committee received Cadet Pell Manus's report. It has been in standard use ever since.